Okay, students, let's look at Chapter 12, Part 2, starting on page 180. We'll start with building boom. When people start coming to an area and moving in, buildings need to be built. People need places to live, they need places to shop, they need places to work, they need all sorts of different places. So, building boom starts taking off with this large influx of immigrants in the latter part of the 19th century, which would be in the 1880s, 90s, and up to the early 1900s. So we'll start with building boom. The problems that come along with crowding troubled Newt Wayfeld, but they weren't the only things that bothered him. He also disliked what he considers St. Paul's obsession with newer, bigger, and taller buildings. Wayfeld gawked at hotels and office buildings that towered above him. Some of them were more than 10 stories high. He was amazed that city people could walk by such buildings without giving them a second glance. We country people stop and half break our necks to see the top of the high buildings. They bow their heads a little, gather their clothes about them, put one shoulder to the wind, and press on. We run around the corner to find out where the fire is when we hear a fire whistle. They never mind it, I suppose, until the fire is developed into something worth seeing. Looking at the picture of the building on page 180, completed in Minneapolis in 1890, the Northwestern Guaranty Loan Building rose up as an example of urban growth. 181. It may have seemed to Wayfield that city dwellers were unimpressed with all the construction that was going on around them, but the city people actually took pride in their buildings. Urban residents often boasted about their tallest buildings, pointed to them as examples of how up-to-date their cities really were. By 1890, new materials such as steel allowed businesses to build skyscrapers that rose taller than 100 feet. That same year, Northwestern Guaranty Loan Association opened new office buildings in downtown Minneapolis. The Guaranty Loan, as the people of Minneapolis called it, was the tallest structure west of Chicago. On the day the Guaranty Loan opened to the public, hundreds of people pressed through main entrances to marvel at the breathtaking sight. They stood in the towering courtyard and gazed at the clouds through the windows of the 12th floor skylight. They packed into elevators for up and down trips that, in the words of one visitor, were twice as thrilling as a roller coaster ride. They climbed to the stairs of the fashionable rooftop garden. They inched toward the building's edge for a glimpse of its ant-like pedestrians who scurried over the streets and the sidewalks 200 feet below. To the people of Minneapolis, the Guaranty Loan was proof that their city had gained the ranks of the nation's metropolitan areas. It is of immense importance, wrote the Minneapolis Journal, because it demonstrates the spirit of the Northwestern enterprise is leading this favored region into national and indeed international prominence. Back on 181, electric streetcars began in St. Paul on Grand Avenue in 1890. So streetcars were bumped out in the mid 50s for the most part. Was the end of the streetcars in the Twin Cities. There's a good documentary out there called Lost Twin Cities where you can see streetcars and older buildings that used to be around. There was a conspiracy between Greyhound Bus, General Motors, Firestone, or Goodyear, I can't remember, one of the tire companies, to get rid of streetcars and move buses in to haul people around. So today you notice that we have a lot of buses. However, we have also reverted back to light rail, an expensive venture indeed, but in the end, I think light rail will help move people around a large city with less toxins from automobiles. Continuing on the reading at top of 182. During the next decade, the city experienced a building boom. By 1900, Minneapolis had about 40,000 buildings. Nearly half of them were newer than the Guaranteed Loan. Soon, taller buildings rose over Minneapolis and rearranged the city's skyline, but it was torn down in 1961. The guarantee loan, by then renamed the Metropolitan Life Building, stood as a reminder of a time when 12 stories building was a source of pride and amazement. A faster pace of life. Nude Wayfeld had frowned upon the city's throngs of people and towering buildings. But more than anything, he disliked the pace of the city life. The sidewalks were full of men and women who rushed from one place to another. Streetcars and automobiles raced through the streets. Wayfeld was convinced that the big treadmills of civilization were taking out the joy of life. He believed that the people of the Twin Cities would be happier if they took life more slowly, as the country people did. How I wish the farmers would come in and tie their teams in front of the stores and hotels here. How pleasing it would be to see a bunch of cattle come straying loose up the street to eat hay out of the farmers' wagons, with now and then a stray pig, the same as in Holly. Holly was where he's from. When I long to see Mr. Sill's chickens come as they come over the yard to me. The pace of city life had been speeding up for years by the time Wayfeld arrived in the Twin Cities. New and faster methods of transportation were leading the way. One of the first big changes in Minneapolis transportation began on December 23rd, 1889. Crowds of streets lined to watch as 8 new electric streetcars set out on their first run through Minneapolis. Until this time, horses had pulled streetcars through Minneapolis. The new cars ran on electricity provided by thin wires strung above the street. A driver and conductor stared straight ahead, looking dignified in their long coats with brass buttons. The passengers smiled and waved to the crowds. The electric cars of the busy 4th Avenue line made the round trip in 48 minutes, 16 minutes faster than the horse cars had managed. You can also look at page 182, where there's a bicycle. In 1885, bicycles gained chain-driven gears, which made pedaling easier. These new safety bicycles, it also had a chain guard to prevent clothing from getting caught. Top of 183, in 1895, Minnesota saw its first automobile. Some early cars like this one used electricity instead of gasoline. They were recharged at night in special garages. A few years after the electric streetcars arrived, people in the Twin Cities welcomed another form of transportation, the bicycles. Bicycles began appearing on city streets in the 1890s and soon became popular among men and women alike. Not everyone was happy about the changes brought to their lifestyle. Previous people had stayed close to their families and neighborhoods. Now bicyclists could ride far away from watchful eyes of their family. Some people were disturbed by the sight of women pedaling their wheels through the city. A group known as the Women's Rescue League called the bicycle a threat to health and morals. Most city dwellers, however, including the editors of St. Paul Pioneer Press, said the league was doing more harm than good. But nothing made the pace of a city life move faster than the automobile. The first horseless carriages had begun chugging and bouncing through the Twin Cities streets in 1895. By 1902, Minneapolis alone had an estimated 125 automobiles. Motorists dressed up in their proper driving clothes, dusters, overcoats that protected them from dust and dirt, gloves and goggles for men, and veils for women. Drivers challenged each other uphill climbing competitions and other contests. They loved to go fast, sometimes as fast as 20 miles per hour, which caused many Twin Cities residents to worry about their safety. The Minneapolis Journal warned automobilists to show better manners, a little more thought for others, a little more willingness to divide right of road, with slower vehicles and pedestrians, and a little less of the mad desire to violate all the laws regarding speed will solve the problem. Funny times, funny words. The automobile continued to grow in popularity. By 1920, the growing number of cars was beginning to push horses and push horses, wagons, and buggies off the street for good. Fewer people rode streetcars, ridership began to drop off and would continue to decline until 1954 when the Twin Cities streetcar system finally went out of business. Look at the bottom of page 184. It's a settlement house. Settlement house, a place that helped new immigrants with employment, housing, healthcare, and education and citizenship. By 1910, settlement houses like the Pillsbury House in Minneapolis were helping new immigrants adjust to life in Minnesota. So settlement houses where immigrants came to stay to learn how to adapt to the new culture. City problems, city answers. Newt Wayfeld surveyed the landscape, its masses of people, its towering buildings, its hectic pace, and concluded that growing dominance of the cities was bad for Minnesota. If we're making men happy, and if we are to make men happy and virtuous, we should legislate against letting people build big cities, he wrote. Cities about the size of Holly are big enough. Those bigger than Moorhead should not be allowed. Wayfeld never did try to pass laws against big cities. He realized it was too late for that, and all others did call attention to the problems growing in cities. Slowly but surely, government and private groups started taking action to solve some of these problems. Charities offered help to the poor. Local boards of health passed rules aimed at controlling the spread of disease. Settlement houses like the Pillsbury Settlement House in Minneapolis and the Neighborhood House in St. Paul helped newly arrived immigrants feel more at home. St. Paul, Minneapolis, and other Minnesota cities began setting aside land for parks, museums, library, and other public spaces that made cities more inviting. These and other efforts improved the cities, but they weren't enough to change Newt Wayfeld's mind about the advantages of country life over city life. When we learn to understand it, there is a poetry and unchangeable laws of nature, he wrote. When we look for it, we find there's nothing new under the sun. Minnesota might have once been mostly land of farms and farmers, but in 1920, its image had changed for good. The Homesteading Act of Minnesota farmland had stopped in 1918. Shares of the state's population was increasing steadily. The city's share of the state's population was increasing steadily. A few decades later, half of all Minnesotans would live in cities, but no matter where people lived in Minnesota, more and more of them were encountering common problems that needed solving. Okay, one last thing. Duluth, birth of a city. Duluth's transformation from a tiny settlement into a major city did not happen the same way as it did in St. Paul and Minneapolis. Growth came in spurts, financed largely by wealthy investors from outside of the state. Duluth was a frontier village with about 100 people in 1868 when Jay Cook and some other businessmen and bankers from Philadelphia came to visit. They were trying to decide if they should invest money in the area. The men liked what they saw. There was a natural harbor, a perfect place for a major port. On the hills above the town was the seemingly edge of vast pine forests, a seemingly endless source of timber. It was easy to imagine Duluth becoming a great rail and shipping center where lumber, wheat, and cattle and other products could be moved from train to ship. Cook and his fellow investors were so impressed that they began putting money in railroads and land in Duluth. In 1869, Duluth was a boom town. Houses could not be built fast enough. As all the railroad workers, land buyers, and other newcomers, by 1871, railroads ran south to St. Paul and west to Moorhead. To make access easier for ships, workers cut a canal through Minnesota Point, a peninsula that blocked much of the entrance to the harbor. Now ships would come to Duluth instead of Superior, Wisconsin, on the other side of the harbor. But in 1873, hard times swept the country. Investors like Jay Cook ran out of money. Duluth's first boom was over. The next boom came in the 1880s when the discovery of iron ore in Minnesota's Iron Range. During the next 20 years, Duluth kept growing on the waterfront. The picture below in 1898 was crowded with grain elevators, lumber yards, hundreds of ships steamed through the canal each year. In 1916, a giant steel mill was added. Minnesotans began to realize that their state had a third big city. The end. Bang.